How's it going, everybody? Anybody ready to fall asleep? There we go. Yeah, I've jumped ahead a slide there, so I'm going to go back to this one. I feel like I've been around for a while, a bit of a dinosaur in this industry, maybe. This particular month actually is kind of interesting. 20 years ago, in August, Windows 95 came out. It was also the month that Netscape went IPO. And it's interesting to see, you know, like a lot of the high-tech companies these days that kind of wait years before going IPO. Netscape released version 1.0 only 9 months before that. And for me, I remember when Netscape came out and being excited with this new technology. Because before that, I was playing around with Gopher, and Gopher wasn't much fun at all. And then, you know, I remember Netscape 2 coming out, and I was so excited when Netscape 2 came out. It had this new thing called frames, which were like amazing. I even bought a book about that thick to try to learn about frames and how exciting it was. And the thing is, for me, one of the things that excited me about it was this ability to break down a design into chunks, right? You know, back then, performance was a huge concern. We don't care about performance these days anymore. But back then, you know, with such slow modems, we needed stuff that, you know, little tricks, little techniques that we knew could speed up the process. And so the idea of breaking down a page and like setting the header into a frame and setting the navigation into a frame and setting your actual content into a frame was a great way to deal with those performance issues. Now, of course, we, at this point, kind of recognize all the downfalls from that. You know, search engines didn't know where to find the content, or when they did find the content, it would load up and you wouldn't have all the other frame stuff. And so you'd learn these little tricks like, oh, you know, when you're actually outside of a frame, redirect so you're back to the frame, but hopefully it doesn't redirect you back to the home page, because that would suck. But definitely seeing sort of that thread of that ability to break down a design has, I think, stuck with me over time. Now I'm going to fast forward a little bit to 2003. Damn it, this clicker, I'm going to kill it. Yeah, 2003, George W. Bush celebrating the mission accomplished. Okay, maybe not quite so much mission accomplished, but it was, for me, a very exciting time. I remember around this time, the Wired redesign came out, and Doug Bowman had talked a lot about his process in using CSS for laying out this website. Shortly thereafter, ESPN, Mike Davidson, who's actually now at Twitter, was involved in taking ESPN and redesigning it to use CSS as its layout approach. And that was a dramatic difference from, you know, that stuff 7-8 years prior, where we didn't have to worry about CSS. We didn't have to worry about JavaScript for the most part. You know, all these technologies in such a short period of time came out. And it was also a very exciting time because at this point, blogging had really taken off. You know, around 2001, 2002, 2003, a lot of people, this is the way we communicated. You know, we didn't have Twitter, we didn't have Facebook, and so we would create, you know, these blog rolls where we'd list off all these other sites that we liked, and we'd share all this information, and we'd come up with all these new techniques. And, you know, when I think about how I used to build websites back then, a lot of the stuff was just building sort of really straightforward websites. I would have a home page and an inside page. Next site I worked on, I had a home page and I had an inside page. And all the people that I followed at that time were also building blogs, who were also building a home page and an inside page. A lot of the work I was doing professionally at that time were these government websites. And these government websites would be hundreds of pages of content. And yet, from a design perspective, they had a home page and they had an inside page. So from a design perspective, these things were actually relatively straightforward. And the way I would actually code these sites up really hadn't changed much between sort of 2003 and 2009. I would start at the top. You know, I've got a header, so I'm going to write all the code to style up the header. I've got my content area, which has sort of my main and then my sidebar. I might have sort of a comment section at the bottom and then a footer. And then once I was done writing all the code for that page, I would move on to the next page and figure out what was different. So, you know, from a home page, I might have some special stuff. When I go to my inside, I've got my article, so I'm going to write some CSS for the article, and then I'd be pretty much done. It's interesting to kind of look back at this and realizing, like, why did I code this way? One, how many authors did I have on my website that I needed to write a CSS selector this specific? You know, how many comment number styles did I need to have a CSS selector this specific? Because, you know, when we think about what it is that I was actually trying to style, it was that thing at the end, right? I cared about what the author looked like. I cared about what the comment number looked like. All that extra other stuff that I wrote was completely unnecessary. Now, I mean, I'm going to brag a little bit. My CSS for my own personal website is only 3K gzipped, right? Like, if you could imagine working on any CSS project today and walking away with only 3K, nobody cares about that, right? Like, that is awesome. And unfortunately, you know, a lot of the projects that I've worked on since have been a much larger scale, where instead of dealing with 3K, dealing with 300K or 3 megs, where, you know, you're dealing with thousands and thousands of lines of CSS. And, you know, when you start dealing with a project like that, we end up with something that, you know, this little cat here, oh, look at that, it didn't fall down. Okay, let's try another one. So, you know, this cat, you know, playing Jenga, where you knock out a block and, damn, these cats are good. Okay, let's go with another metaphor here. So, you know, CSS for me kind of feels like this, where I try to make a change and it changes something somewhere else, and then like it changes something somewhere else, and I struggle with this sometimes in trying to clean up these huge code bases to the point where I just get frustrated and give up. I remember when I first started at Shopify, this was 3 years ago, this was their SASS file. They had a single file using SASS, you know, because SASS solves your architectural problems. Clearly. Oh, I'm sorry, that was only the first page. Here's more. You know, it's a lot of code. And the thing is the way that CSS was written was exactly like how I would write for my own blog. There was all the CSS written for the dashboard, and then there was the products page. So the designer would write up all the CSS for anything that was different on that page from the dashboard. And then somebody going onto the products page, onto the orders, all the different screens, and anything that was different, they would write the CSS for and add it to the bottom of that page. So it just became this long, sprawling code base, and you know, you get to the point where it's like, okay, well, I need to change the design. How much of that code can I actually use? What can I change without things going kablooey? And I mean, again, when I think about how I used to do blog designs, I didn't like iterate on my blog design. I would tear it all down, I would rewrite all the HTML and all the CSS and just start from scratch. And when I came in at Yahoo, which, you know, was a great experience, we were actually doing that. All the HTML and CSS that we wrote was completely from scratch. It's a very freeing situation to come in and be able to completely obliterate the entire code base and then apply all the things that you've learned over the years. And of course, you know, you think this project is going to be perfect. This is the one I'm going to get right. Coming into Shopify, we decided not to do that. We decided to take an iterative approach, and you know, how do we take this huge sort of monolithic code base and start breaking it down? Now, to me, one of the key things that we want to look at is patterns. Now, from a design perspective, patterns are extremely useful, right? We have a bunch of stuff on the page, but if it all looked exactly the same color, the same font size, not really having any kind of hierarchy, it would be confusing. You wouldn't actually know what to look at first, what was the most important thing. And so we start creating exceptions. We want to draw attention to different things on the page, and we do that through things like positioning. Stuff at the top of the page might be more important than the stuff at the bottom of the page, or if you have a bunch of things lined up, we might make one slightly out of place to draw attention to it. We use color as well to make things stand out. We use size, we use shape. These are all useful tools when it comes to design. Now, the thing is that, with any kind of code base that's spread across hundreds of pages, we might not have noticed that, these patterns suddenly kind of got all out of control. I love this. This is a slide from one of Brad Frost's presentations. This was taken from a single web page off of a banking website. Which is crazy to think about all the different button styles that they had on this particular page. Obviously not a lot of consistency, but each one in context to where it was probably made sense. Now the thing is that from a CSS perspective, and I think a lot of designers sometimes miss this when they're actually designing, is that every little thing that you design is going to end up in code. And that means that the user has to download that, the browser has to process and render that. And so if we can create more consistency in our design, we actually end up with a more performant website. So one of the things that we need to do is be able to identify and document patterns. So this is a very useful thing. So we have a thing on our website. All right, we have this HTML element. Right? When we look at our actual code, we have perhaps a div, could be a button, could be whatever, but we have this thing, this HTML element that we need to look a certain way. And it sits amongst a whole bunch of other stuff. And so we need some way of saying, okay, that particular HTML element, that particular one needs to look a certain way. And so how do we do that? Well, we use CSS selectors, right? We use a selector to say that particular HTML element, if it matches this criteria, should now look this particular way. Now, with that, each HTML element, in my opinion, does something. So I like to categorize the code that I'm writing, both from a CSS perspective, but also from an HTML perspective. I'm going to classify these things in one of 5 categories. So at the very bottom is base. I'm going to write CSS selectors that target HTML elements, right? And just HTML elements. I'm not using classes. I'm not using IDs. This is just to say, like, all my paragraph tags should look like this. All my headings should look like this. All my buttons or tables or whatever that HTML element is should look like this, as no matter where it is on the site, this is that foundation for my website. So if you're using a CSS reset, it's falling under this category. If you're using something like normalize, it's falling under this category. We're not using classes or IDs or anything like that. And then on top of that, we have layout. So layout, you've got a header, we've got a footer, we have a content area, or we might have a grid system that we're using. But we're not really talking about the content that goes in it yet. This is just sort of this structure for the website, this hierarchy that we're creating that we know that we're going to eventually put content into. Now the actual content is going to be the modules. So that might be your navigation, might be your carousel. It might be, all the different pieces. It might be an article. This stuff is the content, and this is where a lot of those design patterns start to come into play. Lastly, on top of that is theming, in the sense of, when you have a design, when I worked at Yahoo, the default design was purple. Not everybody loves purple. And so they would come up with different color themes that people could apply on top of their design. But we didn't want somebody to have to download an entirely new style sheet in order to be able to do that. We just want to be able to define the colors that have changed, that they could come into a modal dialog, pick whatever theme they wanted, and see those changes reflected immediately without having to download a completely new style sheet. So the ability to be able to isolate those particular styles. And then lastly, state. State being this sort of broad, maybe not broad, like a way of saying, this particular item on my page exists in a particular state. So for example, if I have an accordion view, whether an item in that accordion view is collapsed, or if something is visible, or if something is hidden, all these different things are these states that we apply to the stuff on our page, which are essentially just variations of a given thing. So I might have a particular module that has its default look and feel, but then it might have an active state. When I click on it with my finger or with a mouse or with a keyboard, that active state that needs to happen may actually be applied using a class. So, as I mentioned, Yahoo, we have a lovely purple design here. This is the way it was when I worked on it. They've since redesigned. Apparently they didn't like purple either. And so when we think about layout, that idea of breaking down that design into the header, the sidebar, and the content area. And then being able to identify, okay, what is that thing? So for example, the header being a layout, and being able to identify that as a specific thing. The individual module, so whether it was a button or whether it was a customized list view or tabs, all of these individual pieces of content, again, we would classify those things. Tabs, for example, buttons. We love buttons at Yahoo. We had a lot of buttons in the interface, and so we had like large buttons, we had the search buttons, we had the small buttons, the dark buttons. All this stuff that were pretty similar in style, but we just needed to identify variations on those things. And so, our default button style, but then we want to indicate that, okay, we want a variation of that and indicate that button dark. Now, up till now, I've talked about taking a single HTML element and making it look a certain way. Sometimes we have a group of elements that are all related. So for example, the modal dialog. The modal dialog might have a header, a body, and a footer. That's actually a pretty common pattern used in a bunch of different pieces. But we want to be able to associate those child elements with that parent element. And again, using naming convention to establish that connection. So we have our root modal, and then we have those child elements that are associated with those things. Now, once we sort of categorize things, and we've seen a little bit of the sort of naming convention that I like to use, where we have sort of this root module like button, and then we might have our variation, so button hyphen variation. And then we have those sort of child elements, what I called subcomponents, and so you'd have button hyphen component. And most of my modules tend to be fairly small, they're not really complex, so this naming convention has worked fairly well. I can usually figure out just based on the name of it what was a variation and what wasn't. We have, however, seen the rise of what a lot of people call BEM naming convention. So BEM follows this approach where, again, you've got your root module name, like button, but you might have those variations, in this case using double hyphen for those variations, and then double underscores to indicate the child elements. The sort of way it maps to my thinking actually turned out to be pretty much identical. It's really just a naming convention, a preference difference. These days, if I was to do things a little bit different, I would actually end up doing this, where I'd use a double hyphen to separate the component with the variation. I like the simplicity. I find BEM naming convention, the way a lot of people implement it, tends to be a little overkill. So for example, you can imagine having a list view. Well, that's actually technically two words, so you'd have list hyphen view, and then you might have a list view item. And so you have list hyphen view double underscore item. But what if you wanted to style one of those items in a slightly different way? And so you've got list hyphen view double underscore item double hyphen variation. Like it just becomes these like really long class names. And so for me, I try to avoid those like really long things and kind of rethink how I'm trying to build something to avoid long naming convention like that. How many of you were in Hugo's talk yesterday? Quite a few of you. Awesome. This makes this point interesting and applicable. So talking about the Inception Rule, right? Not going more than 3 levels deep. I'm kind of in the same way when it comes to naming convention, in that I try to keep my names really no more than 2 levels deep, where I don't want these long class names where I have like, I'm trying to identify a child element of a child element of a child element and all these variations and these really long class names. I'm going to try to keep that simple. You know, when I think about my HTML structure, you know, that I'm trying to isolate these particular things and separate it from everything else. That I want to separate it from sibling elements. I want to separate it even from child elements. You know, if I have a modal and I have a modal body, I want to make sure that the stuff I put in there is not actually locked and dependent on the actual modal itself. And we tend to see this kind of pattern, right? This thing comes up and it's like, I have this button that appears in a modal dialog, so I'm going to use this selector and say, okay, you know, dot modal child selector dot button. Excellent. This works. However, what if I actually want to use that button in a different context? Because really what I have is I have a button and I have a modal, and yes, this particular button does happen to only exist right now in this modal, but will it for always? The thing is that once a pattern has been established, once a concept has come to life, a designer is going to come and go, hey, you know what? I could totally use that in this thing that I'm doing. You know, in large teams, what we also often see is people solving the same problem. I remember one of the last projects that I worked on at Shopify was for, there was a bunch of different things going on. There was a new dashboard that they were working on, but there was also teams working on sort of like sub-sites within the app that also had a bit of a dashboard view. And each team, there was actually 3 different implementations of the sort of money view, where you would see a $sign, you would see the number, you would see a lower, like a smaller one for the cents beside it. And everybody solved it exactly the same way, but 3 different times, and each in the context of whatever it was they were building, instead of trying to separate this stuff out and, you know, allowing people to be able to reuse these patterns throughout the site. So, you know, this is a simple thing to actually avoid. We just identify, you know, we have a button and we have a variation, and we're just going to say, okay, this particular variation is a slim button. Now, once we've done that, you know, we've isolated this code that we've written, the CSS, and we're going to put it into its own file. So each module goes into its own file. Now, you can see now, you know, if we start isolating things in this way, why having a module kind of referenced in context of another module becomes really confusing, because where do we put those styles? You know, if we had modal child selector button, does that go in the button CSS file, or does that go in the modal CSS file? Does it go in both? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And so if we just indicate, you know, what is it that we're actually trying to work on, and then putting it in that context. So we, you know, isolate these things, and each one goes into its own file. Now, again, one of the other common sort of complaints that I often see from people kind of at the beginning of a project, they think, well, aren't we just going to like keep having more and more files, one for each individual component that we build, each module that we built for our website? And in reality, you should not have a project where every single design pattern could actually grow infinitely, right? Because that's a sign of a couple things. One, you just got too many patterns being used on your website. There's a lot of complexity in that design. That's a lot of code that is being sent to the user. Each module that you create is a new thing for your user to have to comprehend. They have to understand how to interact with it. And so you're just going to end up at a certain point where you hit a limit where it doesn't make sense to create new modules. Now, I think the sort of missing piece in a lot of this is the HTML side of things. You know, we look at a lot of the sort of frameworks that are out there, and even with a lot of the companies that I've worked with talking about CSS architecture. The company I work for now, Zurich, they are kind of in a similar place where they have a large code base and are trying to figure out how to refactor this with so many different teams and actually different technologies, and saying, okay, you know what, we just want to touch the CSS. We're going to let people worry about the HTML and whatever front-end tooling that they're using to get there. But the thing is that CSS, you know, as much as we try to decouple it from HTML, is still trying to style HTML. Like there's only so much we can separate those two things. Every line of CSS, every selector we create is trying to target an HTML element. And when I was at Yahoo, the way we approached that was each module, each piece had a template. We use Mustache. I'm a big fan of Mustache. I like the simplicity of it. I liked the lack of logic in that templating system. You know, let the controller, let the sort of model stuff figure out what the data should actually be, and then just merge that with the template. So you know, the actual template itself ends up being pretty straightforward. You know, whatever it is, we're just going to inject some content into that, and then you know that content could be mock data, it could be live data in a sort of JSON format. You have the actual HTML template, and then you might even have like localization strings that you're merging in with this, which is fantastic for testing you know, multiple localizations. So whether or not, you know, what does my button look like when it's in Russian? What does it look like when it's in German? What does it look like in Greek? You know, what does it look like in right-to-left interfaces? And we can start to look at that on a per module basis. And we can also look at that in larger and larger contexts and try to figure out where our design breaks. So this, you know, componentization, where we've taken CSS and HTML and isolated these things, we're starting to see that approach actually make their way into frameworks like React, where you can actually create a component, in this case with its own tag even, so like the video tag here where you can assign some content to it. Under the hood will actually generate an HTML structure, that there's a template that is behind that which has the HTML and the CSS. And so when you think, okay, well, I've got this module, this thing that is isolated, that is, so for example, a button, that I could create a button React component and then define some variations, that I've got this React component HTML, possibly some associated JavaScript, and even associated CSS, all isolated from everything else on the page, right? That we have this thing that I can reuse in a bunch of different projects really easily. Now we're also starting to see sort of browsers natively try to support this through web components. This idea of being able to create this chunk of code and being able to include HTML and CSS that is only applied to this particular module. Okay, so we've isolated something, but the thing is that a system of components still needs to come together in some way, right? We need to, you can't just go to a page and have a single button. We need a button next to form inputs, next to, you know, this layout and all this stuff that's coming together. And so one of the first things that I wanted to talk about, you know, when we think about how do we bring these things together, is there was an article by Hayden Pickering, trying to make sure I got the name right, talking about the OWL selector. Hey, OWL selector. Basically, you're saying that anytime we have a bunch of elements next to each other, that we want things to happen in a certain way. So for example, I might want to say that if I have a bunch of elements together, give it a margin of 5 pixels or 10 pixels. So we're going to... I don't know if you guys are familiar with the give a hoot, don't pollute. It's kind of a US saying. I'm Canadian, so I just... okay, so we want to be maybe a little bit more specific and say, okay, what happens when I have buttons next to buttons, right? That I'm going to have something that, if it's on the left-hand side, I'm not going to have any padding or margin on the left-hand side, but between the individual buttons, I actually want some padding. I want some margin, between those particular elements. And so I can use a selector like this to say, okay, button plus button next to each other will have a certain amount of margin. I can do that with cards, I can do that with inputs, whatever the thing is that I'm trying to do. But as you can probably imagine, what happens when we have modules of different types next to each other? I want to do .input plus .button because I have a text input with a button next to it. That's a pretty common pattern that I might use in my particular design. Where does this CSS live? Does it live in the button file? Does it live in the input file? And it's actually for this reason that I've advised against this particular pattern. And so one of the things that I don't tend to talk a lot about, and I still feel really uncomfortable in doing this, is helpers. The reason is because most helpers are basically a way of avoiding inline styles in the sense of, you know what, I want this thing when it's next to this other thing, this very specific use case, and I want to nudge it one particular way, or I want it to look a little bit different. And so what I really want is to be able to apply margin left 5 pixels or margin right 10 pixels to this very specific element. And so, at Shopify, we actually had a file of these helpers, and they had really cryptic naming convention. So like MM, which was like double the margin, but then you'd end up with things like P, PP, PPT, and it was kind of this really complicated, confusing system. And so, you can lay out space, but that gets really long naming convention. Nobody likes that. Or you can do things like M5, M10, MI6. Okay, British. Yeah, you guys get the British stuff. Okay, that's good. And what I recognize is that in most cases, these helper elements are used for layout purposes, that you are trying to adjust the spacing between all these pieces. So as much as I want to say there's this new classification of stuff called helpers, in a lot of cases, most of these things are actually layout specific. And so, whatever naming convention you want to come up with, as Stephen said, I'm not prescriptive in that way. Figure out what works for you and your team. But recognize that, all these things, if they're layout, group them together, come up with a naming convention that you can identify that these things are really trying to help how you lay out all these different pieces together. So that's important. Now, media queries. Media queries, fantastic, wonderful things. When we think about responsive or adaptive web design, extremely useful in creating websites that work across multiple devices. Now, I'm not coming up here to say don't use media queries. Absolutely, media queries are extremely useful things. The problem is that media queries still look at things at a page level. In other words, if I have module A in module B in layout C, then do this, right? That I am trying to think of everything in this page together, and figuring out, okay, what happens under these circumstances? So, I have to figure out how all these things work together and define rules as to how those things should work together. When my preferred approach would be to say, well, actually, this particular module, let's say it is like an article call to action. So there's a small image, a bit of text, and then a read more link. And if I have a certain amount of space available to it, I want the image to the left and the text to the right with a read more link attached to the bottom right. Versus, when it doesn't have enough room, I want the image on the top followed by the text, followed by the read more link, maybe on the left. That from a design perspective for that component makes a lot more sense to me. And as a result of that, the way I have to do that right now is, okay, well, when I have this particular component inside this particular component, inside this particular layout, on this particular page, is going to look this way. When, what I would really like to do is just say, if I have this much room, do this. Now, the approach to that, the way to do that is with element queries. Fantastic browser technology that doesn't exist. Damn it. I'm going to put a prediction out there. I'm going to say within 2 years we have this. I really hope so. Because it does allow us to still continue to build in this modular way and thinking about these things right now. At Shopify, we took this element query approach. Unfortunately, you have to do it with JavaScript. We can't, CSS doesn't have it. HTML, you can't do it with HTML. So we use JavaScript to actually calculate and figure out, okay, based on sort of these media queries where we would say this particular module, if it has this much space, apply this class to it. And that approach worked really well. It allowed us to continue to isolate these particular modules. The problem there was that those declarations no longer existed along with the rest of the CSS. They had to live somewhere else. So, those things for us lived in JavaScript. I've seen other implementations where they actually create those declarations in the HTML. But it is kind of confusing as to where that stuff is. Maybe one of the advantages if you were going the React route is if you have your HTML in React, all your templating in React, if you're using all your CSS in React, being able to put this kind of logic in JavaScript with everything else would actually work out quite well. So I think the last thing I wanted to touch on was a little bit about style guides. Now, I can imagine you guys probably don't want to read all that, so I'll read it for you. So keep in mind that I'm self-taught, so my code may be a little messy. She walks over, let me see, I'm sure it's fine. Wow, this is like being in a house built by a child using nothing but a hatchet and a picture of a house. It's like a salad recipe written by a corporate lawyer using a phone autocorrect that only knew Excel formulas. It's like someone took a transcript of a couple arguing at IKEA and made random edits until it compiled without errors. I didn't actually see that video. I probably should have watched that where the guy did puns based on IKEA stuff. Yeah. Anyways, he says, okay, I'll read a style guide. And of course, you always have to go with the alt text. I honestly didn't think you could even use emoji in variable names or that there were so many different crying ones. And sure enough, that will work. Help me. Okay. So, once we've done all this stuff, it's important to create some standards for your CSS. And one of the most important things, I have worked at a few companies where CSS was kind of this weird exception. Like any JavaScript you wrote, any PHP or Ruby, that thing was code reviewed. Nothing would go live until it was code reviewed. Hey, I've got this bunch of CSS I'm putting in. Oh, that's fine. Go ahead. Whatever. If you do nothing else, if you learn nothing else today, I hope you go back to your projects and say, you know what, we haven't been doing code reviews of our CSS. Start now, because you want to establish that consistency, and that consistency is very important. Now, a really good resource for kind of establishing a number of things around pattern libraries and style guides is styleguides.io. It's a great resource. Includes links to articles. They do a podcast, they being Anna Debenham and Brad Frost. So extremely useful resource. Speaking of Brad Frost, he and a few others put together this wonderful tool called Pattern Lab, which so far has been pretty much the only sort of prototyping sort of open source tool that came closest to the stuff that we were doing at Yahoo. So extremely useful in being able to take a look at a design at a modular level. So you could say, okay, what does my button look like? What does my carousel look like? And then start looking at that in larger and larger contexts. Being able to look at that with different media queries. You know, how does my design or how do my different modules respond under different conditions? So that in itself also is a very useful thing. At Shopify, we ended up building our own internal style guide. That was, again, extremely useful. The moment we put this in place and let the engineering and design team know, we had people coming back to us where they would work on a project and say, yeah, we used the style guide, and we had this stuff built so much faster than what we had before because we knew where to look. Because their process before was, well, I saw something similar over here. I'm just going to copy and paste the code and hope it works. And they might not notice when things weren't the way they were supposed to. I remember someone had created a new form, and as a result of copying and pasting stuff, was missing styles. And it got merged and went into production. And coming to it and going, well, let me see, all my form fields line up except for this chunk that was clearly copy and pasted from somewhere else. So those types of things, having a style guide are extremely useful to have. You know, that we can avoid the sort of jumble of systems and have a lot more consistency in our design. And, you know, for me, it's important that patterns and pattern libraries and style guides, this documentation creates a conversation around what exceptions should or should not exist. I think that you know, this thing shouldn't be a wall to creativity. It should not be this thing that, you know, you can point to and go, you are not allowed to create anything new because the style guide says so. There are problems to be solved, and the designers should be able to come and say, you know what, I tried solving it using this pattern. This is where it fails. I would like to do something new. And then, you know, that conversation allows you to figure out, okay, well, I know what you're trying to do, and if you do that, can you think about all these other use cases of where it's being used that you might not be aware of? So I find that thing very useful. To give you an example of that, when I was at Shopify, we have these little drop downs, right? You click on actions, we get a little drop down, it's got a little thing up there. And then the designer was working on this thing, the search autocomplete. You start typing, shows some results, and a link to view more. And I said to him, well, you know, he tried to code all this in a very context-specific way. Like, again, the class names, if you can imagine, were like, okay, well, I've got search. Well, it was actually search autocomplete. So there was the search hyphen autocomplete, search hyphen autocomplete input, search hyphen autocomplete dropdown, search autocomplete dropdown link, and it just became this like really complicated thing. And well, I said to him, I mean, a lot of the styles are very similar to the other dropdown that we have. Can we just like kind of align these things? And sure enough, that's ended up what we did. We actually created the search dropdown to create that consistency and actually just use the same code. So you can see here, you know, that opportunity to one, just write less code, which is fantastic, less to maintain, and create more consistency in our design patterns. Because dropdowns turned out to be a thing that we actually use quite a bit. Things like calendar pickers, things like this sort of filter navigation, contact cards, all of this stuff ended up being really important for us and being able to establish this kind of consistency in our design. So I am going to go right to the end. Yay! So, yeah, thank you very much for having me here.
I disagree with everything you just said.
Awesome.
I'm kidding. Do we have any questions? I can't imagine that we have no questions for Jonathan. We have time for one or two. Yeah, that's what that means. That's two. Two questions. Here we go.
One problem I facing always often is where to distinguish between theming and module, because like a round corner, is it belongs to a theme or is it more like part of the model? How do you decide that?
So to me, theme is something that a user can change. So it, you know, in the case of the Yahoo and the context there was users were able to come in and make a client-side change to the UI. You know, they could come in and collapse the sidebar. These types of things were more, to me, those were theme related. If something is just a visual thing, the thing is that every line of CSS that you're writing is a visual thing in some way. Theming, in fact, for most projects, is completely unnecessary. Yahoo is the only project to date that I've worked on, even considering my freelance career. My you know, I've worked on hundreds of projects, and Yahoo is really the only one that I've worked on that had any kind of theming component. When I was actually writing the SMACSS book, I was tempted to leave theming out completely, and I just kind of put it in for completeness. But for pretty much any design, like even if you were white labeling a project where you said, okay, this particular client is going to get a green design, but then we're going to ship another code base for this other client, and it's going to be blue. In that particular context, the actual generated CSS should not have any theming component to it. To me, the theming in that regards is color variables, right? So if we're using a preprocessor, and I guess I should probably clarify that, I'm definitely not anti-preprocessor. Totally awesome, I love them. And variables are a really good reason, one of the many reasons why. So taking those things, isolating, you know, color out, typography, and creating those variables and applying that throughout the design. But the actual compiled CSS is going to be a single thing. It's not going to be a separate CSS file where you would say, okay, here's my sort of blue CSS theme file. And so things like border radius and drop shadows and all that kind of stuff are part of the design and part of the CSS that you're trying to create. So hopefully that clarifies.
Any other questions? Yes.
What do you think about using attribute to define a module instead of a class?
So using an attribute instead of a class, you can. Like there are, I would say, some cases. I mean, at the end of the day, you're writing a selector, right? You're writing a selector to identify this particular element. So whether you want to put that in a class or whether or not you want to put that in an attribute selector, to me, classes are for CSS. Like that's the way I'm going to identify things. I'm going to classify this HTML element. But you can absolutely use attribute selectors. So if you wanted to set up like a data-module variable and start declaring stuff in there, and then using a CSS selector to target that attribute, sure. I mean, you're accomplishing the same thing, right? That's why things like inline styles in React has a bit of buzz these days. And you know, if somebody says inline styles, oh, we don't do inline styles. That's bad. But when you realize that, again, the principles behind it are exactly the same. We're creating an HTML template, and we're trying to take this CSS and apply it to only these particular elements. Those types of things, it's just the same concept applied in a different way. So same thing there.